All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have our friend Daniel Schmachtenberger returning, and we are very lucky to have Gilbert Morris visiting us as well. Gilbert is a philosopher, legal scholar, and former diplomat, and author of numerous books. An absolute genius. If you I was like blown away by his scope of knowledge listening to him speak with Daniel. And both Daniel and Gilbert have had a wide-ranging conversation on the history of racism and racial conflict relevant to the American situation, which was posted back on the Stoa in September. And they're visiting today to continue that conversation with us here at the Stoa. So how today is going to work, we're here for roughly 90 minutes. I'm going to take in Daniel in a moment, and he's going to kind of have an opening, set the frame for the opening exchange that he's going to have with Gilbert, set the context of why they're here and why they're dialoguing about this issue, and then we'll pivot into for Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Daniel or Gilbert. If you submitted a question on the survey, please let me know privately in the chat so I can know you're here and I can take you in. And yeah, that's it on my end. So Gilbert, Daniel, welcome to the Stoa, and Daniel, Teg, you're it. You're on mute, Daniel. Which is one thing Gilbert was calling you out on quite often in your exchange with him. There you go.
All right, can you hear me well now?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm happy to be back and getting to do the Q&A of this session, and happy to see everybody who's here. So opening remarks about the intention of this and a little bit of a recap from the last one that I'll give, and then Professor Morris will do the same, and then we'll dive on into people's questions, which is the intention today. In case there are some people who are here that did not watch the previous one we did, this was intended to be Q&A for that one. If you did watch it, awesome. If not, it was our second recording actually, and we squeezed it into like 3 hours because the first time it was like 6 hours, and we decided that not enough people would make it through. But it could really easily be much, much more than that, because what Gilbert was trying to do was walk us through a few thousand years of history of slavery globally, of racial conflict globally, of philosophic rationalization and economics benefits of slavery, and the encoding in law that all create context for what was both in common in the American slavery situation with others, but also what was very unique about it, that brings us to the uniqueness of the current conflict. That is all really important part of the context for saying, how would we understand this well enough to know how to go forward? My intention in hosting that, or in having that conversation with Gilbert, very important for me to be clear, I do not have any deep expertise in this topic. I had earnestness and curiosity and a lack of expertise. And there were a few people that did a kind job of educating me, and Gilbert was the person who was able to kind of walk me through the history of different schools of racial theory, and how did critical legal theory turn into critical race theory, turn into the woke movement and BLM, and how is it held differently in different countries, and kind of help me understand not just the history of it in an objective sense, but the different views on it. And I think why it felt very important to me was somehow I think the Stoa has done an amazing job of being metapolitical and not getting partisan captured, and being able to have people that are traditionally far right and far left both be in conversations together. But the Stoa, Rebel Wisdom, IDW corner of the universe that I have found myself in has a leaning in the anti-woke direction that affects a number of things, racial conflict being one of them. And it felt like it was attack of the worst elements of wokeism without a deep understanding of the history or the real issues, and kind of straw manning rather than steel manning. And one of the things we talk about so much is, let's make sure to not be adding to culture wars, that we're truly steel manning the other perspective to be able to find synthesis. And it felt really important to, in this corner of the universe, steel man the history of the racial conflict issues and the unique American case to say, what is the actual problem space here? What are the solutions that have been tried? Why would people not feel good about those solutions? So as to be able to see how to forward it. Most of the questions that people have today about how do we actually solve these problems, or what about somebody else's thoughts on the history, will be directed at Gilbert, because he has the expertise here, and I'm mostly here to support, facilitate. I think one thing I want to just comment on is I get two comments almost equally often because of what I do have some expertise on in terms of global catastrophic risk. There are people who are working in, say, the cutting edge of AI risk or synthetic biology risk, and they're like, why would you waste any time focusing on an issue like racism that does not portend the ability to kill all life on the planet in the next few years, when we're at the brink of possible nuclear war between NATO and Russia that both have strategic nuclear arsenals, and when we're doing gain of function research with synthetic biology and leaky labs that could kill almost everything, and the speed of AI is what it is, and you could work on those. Like, racism is just not a comparably destructive issue to all life. That's and how close we are with planetary boundaries on catastrophic die-off of dead zones and whatever. I get another perspective that says it is a privileged position to be able to think about existential risk in the future, because people who are living in the ghetto or comparably in a refugee camp or whatever are facing existential risk every single day. That is not a future forecasted thing. It's a real here and now imminent reality that you're taking attention away from to focus on hypothetical things, and specifically systemic racism through the system called police and the judicial system in many areas of the US is a existential risk to many people today. So like both of those have some truth to them. And I think the thing that has called me is how all of the issues are interconnected, the meaningfulness of all of them, and how we can try to pay attention to that, hopefully more competently with finite attention and finite energy. One thing that I will say about why is it actually a really big deal beyond, why is it a really big deal to the overall thriving of life on the planet long term, not just the individual people and populations that it is affecting in the US today, or the history of it, is when we see how much an issue like race in the US, factoring how you cannot separate the institution of the US and its history from systemic institutionalized racial violence. And yet you also can't separate it from leading the world in democratic process rather than autocratic process today, and both are true. If it is at the heart of political divides in the West that can break the capacity to find any way forward of democracy itself, which ends up leading way for autocracy to be the only way forward, in which case they're like, we just don't care what you think, this is what rule of law is from a top-down way, that portends something for the environment and for nuclear issues and everything. So if democracy is not a viable system, that matters for every other issue. For democracy to be a viable system, we've got to actually be able to take issues that are at the heart of our democratic institutions like this and say, can we forward this in a meaningful way? So Du Bois' statement of the color line being defining of the 20th century, and the possibility that the color line is actually one of the defining features of the 21st century as well, is part of why this is such an important, meaningful conversation to me. So with that, Gilbert, thank you for being here, and would love to hear your opening thoughts before we jump to questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And good evening. It's evening here in the Bahamas. So good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's always a great pleasure to be able to engage in conversation in which the presumption is not that we'll never get along. It may be that we won't find agreement, but the agreement is that we should return tomorrow and continue our discussion. And it seems to me that that is a foundation of J.S. Mill's notion of the marketplace of ideas, in which people come to the town square to exchange between themselves without the notion of winning, but with the idea and the ideal of understanding and protecting each other's capacity and opportunity to gain understanding. And so I appreciate that immensely. Daniel and I met during the pandemic, I think, and we got into several discussions on a variety of subjects. But he saw certainly, and I agreed, that that this was a crucial topic which had to be addressed for the reasons which he has said. What I've tried to do is to distinguish between race and slavery. There were flashes of the notions of race very early on in human civilization, recorded history such as we understand it. In about 1250 BC in China, China, like Russia, that has Eugene Onegin, a poem written by a Black man, as its key poem. The Magical Colloon was China's sort of original literary fair. And so at this early stage, there was a recognition of a distinction of race, but there wasn't anything assigned to it that was either negative or positive in the current iteration of the discussions on race. For the most part, the strangeness of the culture behind the race was the key thing that was the point of emphasis. If we come into the period which Daniel and I began at, beginning with Aristotle's concept of the slave, Aristotle did something which he always does. If you ask Aristotle which is the best form of government, he doesn't tell you, he doesn't pick one. He says, well, if you want democracy, this is what it would be. And if you want monarchy, this is what it would be. And if you want that, and so on and so on. So he's not very committal. And he made it seems to me, a cardinal error on a very important subject. And
he's frozen. Is that?
So it seems.
And you want to pick up where he left off?
I cannot. I cannot pick up on the cardinal error that Aristotle made in this particular topic. We'll wait for him to come back. As we do, I'm hoping that the opening remarks don't take up too much of the time, because we really want to get into people's questions. And so I'm curious if people, as Gilbert gets back online, have questions that they want to start populating in the chat. That would be wonderful. And of course, if it is a question is great. If it is a comment that wants to be discussed, that is also fine. And since I do not know how long it will take for Gilbert to get back, I am willing to engage any that I am competent to right now. Oh, there he is.
Gilbert's back.
All right, you were muted, Gilbert, but you were back.
From there.
All right, we lost you at the cardinal mistake Aristotle made.
Yes.
And we were just saying that as you got back on and we finished our opening comments, that we'd get to questions. So people are starting to work on questions, but please continue with what was important.
Yes, I'm not going to say much more than that preliminarily, except to say that what we were able to do, I hope, was to trace how this open cavity, conceptual cavity that Aristotle left, was constantly filled, conveniently filled with notions of race as distinct from slavery. And it almost became irresistible, and has become something very interesting. The people who were formulating these notions of race, they knew that their statements and I wouldn't even say their attitudes, their claims about race, they knew that they were false. The problem is when there's an acculturation problem and an intergenerational flow of understanding. And what eventually happens is the first generation knows that what they're saying, those claims are false. But the second generation, this is all they've ever known. By the third generation, it becomes completely accepted. And now it's almost impossible to dislodge. And then something interesting happens. The victims of this, and we're speaking very broadly here, they then, having their backs against the wall, take up the mantra of these racial nomenclature and definitions and wear it as a badge of honor. And then a false or meta-level conversation begins where people, having been pushed or ensconced into a racial language and a racial acculturation that is misdefined, then defend themselves out of that, wearing it as a badge of honor. And in this way, you can never have a real honest conversation about race because both parties are speaking at such an asymmetry that it's impossible now to achieve alignment. And so what we are seeing with what is generally called the wokeness, although that was a positive thing at one point, then it became a negative thing, strangely enough. And or like discussions about critical race theory. Critical race theory was at one point merely the acceptance of a different perspective on the history. Some people would say the truer perspective on the history to be included in the curricula. And because the coordinates of the race conversation have been so bastardized, it's almost impossible for the two sides to meet in an area of understanding. I'll make one last point about that. I was having a talk with someone named Richard Kimball, and he writes for a Catholic magazine. He's quite famous. And when I arrived in America in 1995, I was giving a talk at the St. Thomas Aquinas Society, somehow met at the Four Seasons in Washington, DC, how the Christians have come up in the world. But what was interesting there, he was talking about charter schools because each side seems to have these very strong positions on particular things. And so he was talking about charter schools. Now, coming from the Bahamas and growing up in the British system, where private school means government school and public school means private school. And all these things have to do with class rather than racial divisions or anything having to do with, say, in the American situation where taxes are paid or schools are financed from property taxes and therefore the best zip codes have the best schools and so on. And we were talking about charter schools, and the person was saying to me, oh, one should have a right to choose which school one child goes to. And I thought, yes, that's true. I believe in choice, so no problem. Therefore, charter schools are an excellent way to exercise that choice. And my point was, but don't you see, that means that you've committed to the idea that the government, everyone pays taxes to the government to run a proper public school system. And while you can have your charter schools, you cannot make the argument that there's a clear tracery from the idea of choice to charter schools. The real problem is your tax model is vulgar. That's the real problem. you're not having a real conversation about schools because you're willing to say charter schools are not available to everyone. For democracy to work, you have to have broad education. For broad education to work, you have to have good public education. Public education, the bargain that we make in democracy is that we pay taxes so that there's a generalized equality of opportunity across the political sphere. And if you get into these cul-de-sac arguments about fundamental principles and what seems to me somewhat exotic choices, you're not having a real conversation about the fundamental issues that plague the society, it seems to me. And so I think the racial conversation has sort of migrated into such a cul-de-sac where people are not speaking really from the same position from fundamental principles about some ideal which everyone adheres to. And even if people do adhere to them, they seem afraid to admit it because it gives too much to the other side in the argument. And the capacity seems to have been lost or somewhat waylaid in this ability to make the proper argument to get to the point of the ideal, which probably would have broader agreement. And where you'd have broader agreement. So I'll leave it there. That's what we tried to achieve in the first discussion, and then we can go to questions.
I see some questions that I would focus on because I think they're, knowing some of your solutions, I think they're fruitful areas. So just to kind of guide the conversation a bit, I think for many people it might be like, why the fuck do you start with talking about ancient China and Aristotle when we're talking about the situation in the Americas? And I beg of everyone to have the benefit of the doubt and the attention span to follow what seems like a circuitous route, because it is actually fascinatingly relevant. And oftentimes when there's a wicked problem that seems intractable, it's because the framing is wrong and we actually have to step out of the frame. So it's interesting if we take Aristotle having been such an influence to Western thought and the idea of a natural slave, that some people are disposed naturally as slaves, and then we take motivated reasoning and the desire to answer the question, who are the natural slaves? Like, it was a very, very good frame by one of the leading thinkers to then have everybody seeking to answer that. And then, of course, economic motive creates motivated reasoning and blah, blah, blah. So I think the topic of motivated reasoning and how mind-blowingly easy it is and destructive it is, it would be one of the first things we would say we would want in a conversation regarding racial conflict, is racial conflict ends up pertaining to actual conflict around economic issues where there are real scarcities. Like, are we going to actually deal with the intergenerational wealth issues of that the GI Bill should have happened, those cities shouldn't have been burned down, there should be Black populations with a lot more generational wealth than they have. Are we going to have a situation where nobody wants to just give up their wealth? There aren't that many people who have it, even if it came through non-fair means, who want to give it up. Does that mean that then we write law to change it, where law means that it's backed up by police and a monopoly of violence to take some people's money, give it to other people? There's hard fucking issues in here, right? Like, we get down to conflict theory over scarce rivalrous resource that affects the actual materiality of people's lives. So to at least say, hey, we're all subject to motivated reasoning here because the effect of this conversation has real materiality differences in our lives. Can we at least try to notice our unmotivated reasoning on each side, get out of it, recognize the sensitivity of it, and see a way forward that is at least possible? I think that's a very good thing to keep in mind. Gilbert, you went into the topic of schools, and that's obviously one key thing. And one of the questions someone asked here is about schools. And I know one of your solutions has to do with schools. And that given that one of the biggest issues is not just, could we make situations that have no institutional racism today? Could we make laws where we fix redlining and we fix institutional racism in police force today? That doesn't solve the historical issue. And wealth is a big thing, and generational wealth is a big thing. The historical issue is where the reparations or whatever come up that is such a clusterfuck of a topic. And you discussed in the previous one the difference between restitution, compensation, reparations. But how do we make a path that does provide fair equality of opportunity, factoring how much that has been damaged in the past, but that doesn't require some of the things that are more impossible to move through politically? You have a model with the historically Black colleges and universities that I think is really fascinating, that I think is worth talking about here. And as an entry, someone asked this question. So I think 1, 2, if we could get to historically Black colleges as a second topic. And the first is someone asked, Kevin, is there an ideal way to teach about race and racial conflict in schools? And he says, ideally throughout different levels of cognitive and emotional development, elementary up through middle school and high school. Obviously, you have taught about this topic in a university setting. Different states teach about it differently in the US currently. Is there anything you'd like to share around how the school education of this topic could be meaningfully better?
Yes, there's a tedious hermeneutics which goes into this, because one has to perform a kind of unraveling first and then come forward because people are ensconced in the points of views with which they have been raised. And there are social structures which seem to appear to confirm people's prejudices in many respects. I don't speak of racism as an emotion, for instance, but rather as a set of structures. Everyone is prejudiced. So, for instance, you hear the topic, well, everyone can be racist, or reverse racism, or that sort of thing. So, one of the things we would try to examine, without insisting that we had the right point of view, certainly when I was teaching, and in this case, I was teaching the faculty to teach, to explore ways of teaching about race. And one of the things I said was, well, let's look at it. Everyone has prejudices. We cannot escape that. Black people have prejudices. White people have prejudices, women, men, all these sorts of things. But on the racial question, it seems to me that when a person has a prejudice and also has the power, and there's a structure that allows that power to be exercised to make preferences on the basis of race, that is racism. So that's not an emotion or a feeling. That is prejudice with the vertical of power to be able to apply that prejudice in the apportionment of benefits in a society where everyone pays the same taxes, but only one group of people, because of that prejudice and its relative, the power associated with it, to be able to coordinate outcomes. And if we think of it like that, it seems to me we get to some very interesting places about the notion of racism. It doesn't let Black people off the hook for being unkind and for having, virulent prejudices, but it also is able to demonstrate, you're also able to isolate how power structures work in such a way that certain people can enact their prejudices on everyone, whereas other people have prejudices, but they can't enact them. They don't have the power structure or the vertical of power to do so. So that's one little frame that we speak about. One of the things I speak to Black Americans about is the term African American. And I try to explain that if you think about the continent of Africa before the 17th century, the average person in Benin could never see himself as an African. He saw himself within the terms of this particular tribe. So if you were a Tiv in what is now Nigeria or Igbo, or you were a Bassa in what is now Liberia, or Vai in one of those places, that's what you saw yourself as. And you saw, if you were a Bassa, you saw the Vai as different from yourself as the Mongolian from the Swiss. because these are ancestral cultures with long oral histories, and these oral histories and ancestralism created, in fact, a sociological divide between these micro civilizations in some cases that separated them from one another. So that the argument came to me that, well, the Italians call themselves Italian American, the French call themselves French American, although I've never heard a French American call himself a French American. I think most of the Irish do that, and the Italians. And Thomas Sowell has some wonderful writing about that, actually. And I would say to them, well, it seems to me you've begged the question, because if in fact we're going to claim that the history has been sort of lost, right, or at least there's been a separation, a displacement, and a marginalization from the lines and the tracery of the history, it seems very much to me that you have to leave it that way and not use so nomenclature as a bandage for that, and rather leave it the way it is. So that would mean that the Blacks are just Americans because they can't make a historical reference or cultural or ethnological reference to their point of origin. And that forces the question to have to come up over and over again, and forces a public debate. Now, you may not agree with that, but that's in the framing. It seems to me that in all these little areas, one has to try and work these things out. This is part of the walking back of the encrustication of what is, I think, are a set of bad arguments that sit on top of the history. Last point, Daniel, in our discussion, I made this distinction, this notion that that somehow people who were virulent enslavers and also hypocritical enslavers, that they were simply people of their time. And I reject that one rather vigorously. And I think we were able to demonstrate, if you juxtapose the lives of Lord Mansfield and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson takes a young girl who's 14, and he makes her his amanuensis and amaretta, and he does that. And I remember Joseph Ellis, the historian. I met him when I first came to America, and he was talking about presentism. And it's funny that at the time, he also made a statement when in discussing presentism. He wrote a book called American Stinks, and he was promoting this book. And it was at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., I think. And at that discussion, he said something like, Jefferson was far too moral to engage in an immoral relationship with an underage child. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I just come from the LSE where, we were methodologists and we analyzed things with a kind of brutality. And I didn't know how to respond to this strange and estranging statement. And I think that this is part of the asymmetry and what I've referred to as monumentalist history. So there's a relation to history in which people wish it to be monumental. And when I say that, you have in the schools at the moment in Texas and some other places, people deciding on which textbooks to use and which not to use. And people have said things like, if history makes me feel bad, we should rather stay away from that because we should have a glorious notion of our country. And it seems to me that this is an unfortunate proposition. It is not the case that the people that we spoke of were people of their times, were the people of their times. Slavery was always contested at every stage in history, always contested. Racism was always contested at every stage of history. The literature shows that. All the research shows that in an incredible way. And even in America, from about the 1630s to the 1690s, when the notion of racial inferiority and white supremacy gained its paramountcy, there were people who were opposed to it bitterly, and a broad cross-section of people as well. In fact, you had the raging movement going on in Britain at the time, with people like, well, later on with people like Wilberforce and some of these people, and then before him in Europe, people like Nicholas of Cusa and so on, who argued against these sorts of things. And so we tried to give a frame in a way to allow scholars to see that the arguments which have been developed in this late period of our history, that those arguments don't have a foundation, and when you press upon them, they tend to fall apart. Thomas Sowell, I hate to disagree with Thomas Sowell, really I do, but he wrote a book, I can't remember the name just at the moment, but it's about slavery, the history of slavery. And I read the book maybe 3 or 4 times on one of these online places and so on. And it troubled me tremendously. He gave a good disposition on how slavery evolved throughout the centuries, but he completely ignored racism and how racism emerged as the currency for the economy of slavery. All right. And at that point, he elided. And so that means that he can't really speak to, when we come to the American context, the use of racism as a kind of epistemology that allowed people to feel comfortable with the diminution of others. And I think it's a mistake, and I would have loved to have sat with him and kind of had that discussion with him. And I would like to think that we would have come to some accommodation on that point, because if you throw your hands up and say slavery has always been with us, American civilization is nothing new, that's not exactly true, right? That's not exactly true. What happened in the case of John Casor, the person who by civil law was transferred out of indenture into permanent slavery, was an abomination of the law known to the people who executed it. They knew that, right? That passed down throughout the centuries and became it became a fixed epistemological point, but that allowed everyone to, or so many people, to excuse their racism and the advantages that it gave them. Jefferson pointed this out, and this is the incredible thing about him in the Notes on Virginia, when he said, I'm troubled at this question of the yes, of this yes that whites have become accustomed to, because in the ordinary processes of life, you wouldn't have a situation where we can satisfy every need, every want, every desire, and all we hear is yes, yes, yes. What happens when this goes away? We will have corrupted ourselves, corrupted our civilization, and we would have had entire generations of people who were used to this. But that's because racism is the purchase for that attitude, right? It was. And I was very sad to see that Sowell did not address that, and in a way that I thought would have been effective. Lastly, your point about HBCUs. Blacks in America are a Canada, such that if the GDP of Blacks were isolated from the rest of America, it would be probably the 8th or 10th wealthiest country in the world. It would be a member of the G20. If that is true, it does raise a question, which also on the other side seems not to be metabolized well on the woke, so-called woke side of the question. If you have this prowess that you have the wealth of Canada why haven't we created a Canada in America for Blacks? Now that raises all sorts of questions about integration, whether there, in fact there's a Black community, whether Blacks work together, whether there are systems that aggregate Black wealth effectively, whether the Buy Black movement, which seems to be more of a kind of folk sort of thing rather than a major economic initiative, whether that's an issue. When you run the numbers, it's something like 1 in 60 or 70 Blacks is a millionaire. And so it raises the question, if there was a desire to be a real community in the sense of, you say, listen, America, e pluribus unum, doesn't mean we cannot have our own, build our own, and integrate that with the rest of society. Because if you're in a negotiation, and as a diplomat, this comes home to me as a methodology, if you have nothing on your side of the table, or if what you have on your side of the table is disparate and dissipated across a vast panoply of people with differing opinions who can't cohere around a set of principles, then you're not going to achieve anything in the debate. Now, for people who are romantic about the idea of an integrated America, this is a problematic thing. But the HBCUs open up an opportunity, it seems to me, to change that in the sense that they already considered Black schools and colleges, although many of them are land grant or funded not essentially or historically by Blacks at all. But let us assume that they are Black colleges and universities for the purposes of discussion. Many of them are also in areas where they have large rural, they're not in urban spaces, they're in large sort of places where you have lots of land. Many of them have lots of property and that kind of thing. And it seems to me it would be an interesting sort of thing if they were to focus on things like the 600,000 technical jobs in the United States that Americans cannot currently fill, and begin to educate with the aim of filling those positions. After all, there's a way in which society is competitive, and this would give a competitive advantage. And any negotiation, you have to have leverage, and this would provide leverage in the sense that Blacks would still be integrated in American society at a much higher level and with a set of defensible skills, all right? Defensible skills, which means that Blacks could not be ignored. And it seems to me that if one were to build such a construct around the historically Black college, and mind you, they had it in dentistry and medicine and mortuary science. These were the things that flowed into the 50 or 60 Black communities in the antebellum period, all right, that distinguished them in America. But those people did not divide themselves from America. They did not separate themselves from America. They did not see them, their white brothers and sisters, as their enemies. They simply thought that we had to build our own. Circumstances led them to that. And if you think of coming out of slavery for several centuries and coming out of the brutal period of a civil war, and out of that civil war, not asking for any benefits, any help, or anything of that sort, and going out and building those communities and then educating themselves to be able to be successful in those communities, it seems to me that that is the greatest ever instantiation and exhibition of the American values in the history of the United States. I'm sorry, I went on a bit there.
Gilbert, I have a question for you that actually I think a lot of people might also have. I wanted to just underscore briefly one thing that you said, in case it wasn't totally obvious for everyone, that I think is so fundamental when you said that Thomas Sowell gave a history of slavery, but he kept it separate from racism.
Yes.
And that when you combine the Aristotelian concept of a natural slave, some people are naturally disposed to slavery and it's actually kind of best suited for them because they cannot sovereignly figure out what to do with themselves. When you combine that with Darwin and kind of the early natural science that was heading in the direction of Darwin with the motivated reasoning, with the Declaration of Independence, you get something so fascinating and unique and gruesome.
Yes.
Where, like, if Genghis Khan has slaves, he didn't say all men are created equal and all deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was fucking brutal and he embraced brutality. And it's like, okay, he's a brutal dude. And he was being brutal across racial lines.
Absolutely.
But if you say all men are created equal, all deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these people are slaves because they aren't men, right? Because we're actually having to say, in order to keep intellectual congruency with all men are created equal, we have to actually make them some evolutionarily lower type of animal. That is a place where slavery with that other value system requires a philosophic formalization of racism that is really uniquely egregious and terrible. And the persistence of that is still felt today is so fucked up. And like, it's just such an important point. And I just want to like acknowledge what an important point that is, because it is very easy to bring up the point, there's always been slavery, which is true. But there has not always been a racial philosophy of slavery that had that subhuman egregiousness to it.
Right.
So I just want to like underscore that and say, I think any remnants of that being fully uprooted and cleared is necessary, right? Like there is no way forward as long as there is any remnants of that mimetic complex.
Right.
Obviously, there is a remnants of it in our institutions and in our culture. So how does the culture become free of it? And how does the institution become free of it? This is now where my question is for you. In some ways, there are issues that I'm focused on, like how do we not all die from advances in exponential tech in something like synthetic bio when we're doing super stupid shit like viral hunting and gain of function research and leaky laboratories where you can make super nasty pandemic weapons and release them everywhere. But we don't need to actually get everyone to understand that to solve it. We need to get a fairly small number of people to understand why that's a really terrible thing and create legislation. The same thing with nuclear deterrence. We don't need to get everyone to understand the complexity of the game theory on the nuclear deterrence well enough. But on an issue that actually arises from culture, right? And then is institutionalized, and where you, as you're saying, everyone can be prejudiced, but they're not all equally able of enacting those prejudices as systemic racism. So those who are subjugated to that need to figure out how to enact power in some other, kind of way. And then when you're bringing up what the solution is, that you start with shit like the concept of African is a problem, right? Like even the word African American, we have to dissect that, and we have to go back to the history of race in ancient China didn't have these issues, and why the papal bulls were an issue in Aristotle. Like, what the fuck chance is there for that level of depth of understanding needed to unwind the fact that even the words have embedded wrong concepts, right? Even the term African American or whatever have embedded wrong concepts, and that we don't need a few people to get it to do regulation. We need widespread people getting it in the presence of vested interests, continuing to feed them bullshit. And in the presence of their own motivated reasoning around it, like it actually seems more complicated. How is there a way forward?
There's a level at which it's very complicated. I'm very sensitive to the choice of language because a language carries within it. In the Caribbean, we have the belief that the words of your mother carry a spirit in them, and people say things like, "You'd better hope your mother does not speak, ill over you, over your life, so to speak." And because we know from pediatric neuropsychology that when a child is bombarded with a certain framing of its essence, it takes that to heart, and in many respects, if it's reinforced in the society, you do a lot of work, as our friend Tristan Harris does, on the limbic colonialism which social media engages in. So we've seen real-time demonstrations of this power of framing issues and using words. And that's the thing. When we use the wrong term, we're not using words. We're creating a conceptual framework. And that framework is one that can influence people's self-conception and their perception of the world. And what is society but some place where we try to align the best frameworks in order that everyone would assume for themselves that they can make the best of themselves in that social setting. I don't think, however, that I think why we have to work on all these things at the same time. I don't think we can get the nomenclature right first. I don't think we can correct the school problem first. I don't think we can do many of these things. I think we have to do all these things at the same time. If a group of people, Dr. King asks a question: Are you seeking to change society, or do you merely want a piece of the pie? So, and this has the notion of the export of harm at the back end of it. So that's just to say, if let's say I'm a Black person who believes that the society in America has done me wrong, and I demand to be integrated into society, to get the job at Aiken Gump, if I'm a lawyer, to get the job at Goldman Sachs, if I'm a banker, to get tenure at Harvard, if I'm a professor, am I not simply asking to be let in to the very system that is in some senses reprobate, in the sense that it never repented, never reflected, never really reassessed itself? It just decided to let me into the same thinking paradigm that had me enslaved and is now exporting that harm elsewhere, perhaps in ways that we cannot see. And so I asked this question in a book that I wrote called The Triptych Papers and Epistemologies of Displacement. The displaced individual exists. And the question is whether he or she looks in his displaced situation for a way to renew the society, or is he looking out beyond his situation into the dominant culture, which has refused him, and seeking a way to enter that dominant culture? But if he does, right, it implies that there will be no reform of the culture, since he enters the culture on its own terms, and may in some ways carve out unique spaces and niches for himself. But those niches don't have the scale to be able to change the culture in a way that's beneficial for everyone. So when one of the things I've told my students is don't own atrocities, don't own prejudice or rather racism, don't own these terrible things which may have happened to you. You cannot say that we as a people are fully susceptible to these things absolutely and forever. It's just, that you can't make that argument. What you can say is, in this period, with this Overton window, with this degree of self-understanding, at this stage in history, with this political structure, with these power relations and verticals of power, it prioritizes this sort of engagement with me, or this sort of framing of my humanity. Now, Dr. King's question, if I want to change the culture, or I could go with Malcolm X here, right? The first thing you need is an act of integrity. That's what Malcolm X said. When you want to change a culture, you need first an act of integrity. The Blacks and many whites who supported them in the antebellum period, who became state senators and lawyers and physicians and so on, that was an act of integrity aimed at changing a culture. It's just that they were overwhelmed by greater forces which they could not control. So it seems to me that if we're going to be practical, the first practical thing is for the Blacks of America, and perhaps almost everywhere around the world, have to ask themselves, are we a community for the purposes of our development and the defense, not just of our humanity, but of human value? That would be an act of integrity, all right? Because, and this is not a Christian proposition. It's not a Christian proposition. In every wisdom text, whether it's the Vedantic scriptures or it's the works of Confucius or wherever have you, you see this paradigm shaping up. Those who have been displaced have an obligation to both mitigate their situation and then to move forward out of that mitigation, not with vindictiveness or revenge, because it actually destroys the act of integrity which was exercised. Instead, you have to reconceive the culture. That is the obligation. And it's a very difficult obligation. And you probably will not live to see it come to fruition. But that is the challenge, and that's the human situation. And I've tried in the best way not to paint it, to use a cliche, with rose-colored glasses. It's a great struggle, and people have sacrificed, both Blacks and whites, for the defense of human value in this way, which currently does not define the dominant culture. So having understood that and seeking an act of integrity, and I won't say here that I have the absolute solution, I will say that if the attitude is such as the one that I'm describing, where you mitigate the atrocities committed against you by being wise, by being sensible. So is there voter suppression? Yes. But then take it as an opportunity for everyone to get IDs. That's actually not a bad thing. That's a very good thing. And in fact, if you exercise yourself on that, you can be the first to integrate digital IDs among Black people. That's a good thing. And that drives into a future towards which we are headed. If we say that, well, Blacks cannot succeed in this school or that school, then come to the Black universities, and the society has a problem finding 600,000 persons to fill technical jobs. Make the degree 6 years, as in Sciences Po in France, or French law degree, and build the basis and the foundation of an excellent education. Thomas Sowell draws this, I'm all over the place at the moment, but Thomas Sowell draws this distinction. The Blacks, the American Blacks in Russia, who were there after the Second World War, remained there after the Second World War, in Japan and Germany, perform in education at the same level of their Japanese, Russian, and German counterparts. The literature shows it explicitly. So in formulating this drive towards this act of integrity, Black Americans actually have something to look at. They have an example to look at in 3 cases where people of their own history, tradition, and culture are succeeding in ways that they're not succeeding in America. The answer to that is not to ask, what is America doing to me? But how can I mitigate my situation, in fact, to reflect the success that those people are showing in those places, find out what they're doing and replicate that. But who is going to initiate this? And how will it be initiated at scale, all right, in order to somehow impact the culture? That is the question. So I'm sorry, Daniel, there's no easy answer. No, and I know you know that. There's no easy answer, and there's no one thing that can be done. We have to promote the idea of the mitigation of atrocity, and that's not blaming the victim. In every area of law, if you read law and you understand, and I'm not just talking about jurisprudence and constitutional theory, I'm talking about basic everyday law of tort, law of contract. you are called upon to mitigate. The law of insurance, you are called upon to mitigate. Someone burns your house down, you saw them burning your house down, and you come upon the house and it's half burnt down, and you stood there and said that someone burnt it down, you did nothing, all right? You're penalized for that. And so this principle of mitigation has to be something that, in the parlance of today's cultural narratives, we must normalize. And then this active integrity is another element. Understanding that we are having asymmetric conversations, that's another element. And then building leverage for Blacks, those Blacks who are committed, building leverage for them. You have the NBA players, you have the celebrities, you have the wealthy Black businesses, you have large numbers, broad cross-section of Black middle-class people. Can an appeal be made to them in any way that is not prejudicial against whites or sows enmity against the dominant culture? But just to say, in our house, we are taking care of those things which are priorities to us. But having built the house, we invite you. So in our conversation, I made it very clear. The historically Black universities should not try to be exclusively Black. In fact, if they are going to do what's necessary to revolutionize the culture and create an evolution in self-conception towards human value, then the thing they would do is say, this is a place that's predominantly Black, in which our white brothers and sisters can achieve their full potential. And if enough of that is happening, the society itself has made itself so sick that these places become repositories of human value that have their own attractive power. Now, that may sound like a whole species of idealism, but I'm afraid that in the circumstances, it's a choice between that and nihilism. I think it's that narrow. It's a choice between that and nihilism. And President Bush, the father, had this phrase, which I enjoy so much. It didn't mean anything when he said it. I think it was written by Peggy Noonan, who has a way with a turn of phrase. And it's 1,000 points of light. That's the solution. 1,000 points of light, right? And if any social effort that we were thinking to undertake to address the problem of the power structure of racism, I think this 1,000 points of light approach would be the approach. And I do know that people like Mark Eckert and Greg Thomas and some of the others are doing a lot of that work already in a wide variety of communities. There were people like Marva Collins, the teacher in Chicago, who took people in with no particular system, taking grandmothers and 3-year-olds, and somehow got everybody into university. What is that? An act of integrity. An act of integrity that was a mitigation against the situation, the forces that were arrayed against her. And so if the dominant society wants to understand how are we spending all this money on children who are not going to university, and Marva Collins can take over a warehouse and teach 3-year-olds and grandmothers and get them into university, obviously our resource allocation and all the efficiency propositions that we brag about, they don't work. And so in this case, from the displaced environment comes a new epistemology capable of renewing the culture, the dominant culture. To me, that is the cycle. And we have to somehow ignite that cycle.
There's so many questions that I want to ask regarding the realpolitik assessment of what it actually takes to do the thing, since the ethics is usually considerations of symmetry, but the ability for enactment is usually considerations of power. And the bunch that I want to get into, but in lieu of time, I want to get to questions. I'll paraphrase what you've said overall, because I think what you're saying so mirrors what I end up saying, talking about metacrisis. There's not a theory of change because there's not one cause of the problem. There's and there's not even one problem, right? There's many different aspects of problems. There's many elements of it. So there's an ecology of theories of change that are needed. Trying to get too reductive to what the solution is, and even too reductive in the problem framing, is then where people get polarized on the thing. And so this is when you're saying, 1,000 points of light, there's an ecology of theories of change. And there's this dialectical principle throughout everything you're saying, which is don't generate enmity in the dominant culture while seeking to change the dominant culture. Seek to change it. Don't just seek to get a piece of the pie, and don't just seek to have your own segregated thing, but don't create enmity with a thing that currently has more enactment power than you have. It's not an answer. It's a set of considerations to hold. And similarly, when you talked about what should be done in education, you were saying, don't just say man of their time, because that's nonsense. And yet I've also heard you say at other times, don't throw Jefferson out as purely evil. You have to hold was a great man, but not a good man. So what I'm hearing you say is, in education, share the authentic complexity. Don't share a weaponized, a sided version that then has other people say, hey, you left out something critical, and then they hold another side. Try to share an adequate complexity of the thing, so people don't reduce it to something that then polarizes. And it seems like what you're saying overall is it's complex. How do we educate people into the authentic complexity, and how do we generate solutions that deal with the authentic complexity? And it is the reductive process itself that ends up leading to a lot of the intractable problems. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask, when it came to questions, seems appropriate. People in the audience who are here who happen to be people of color, if you have any questions or thoughts first, I wanted to offer priority to that, and then see if anybody else does in remaining time.
I have a question. It's more along the lines of like sense making and communicating that synthesis, because I worked in a space where I was helping Black founders get funding, some venture capital, and I came across a lot of the underlying issues of why certain founders had barriers, and the education system, et cetera, like why we had less founders of color in the pipeline. And in the whole culture of polarization and people picking one side, it's just so difficult to communicate truth without giving a point to the other side. Like one example is absent fathers. Like that's something that has been proven to have a negative impact on someone's life, and then their economic outcomes, et cetera. So it's like, how do we best communicate the truth of like what are real barriers that are impacting Black people today without giving a point to like, oh, this is why racism exists, or this is why like the culture is inherently bad in producing good people that are contributing to society. Like I have found that very difficult in doing the work.
Yes, I can empathize with that. I was a private diplomat to the Swiss Private Bankers Association. And if you want to see superiority, you need only spend some time around Swiss private bankers, and you'll have a clear picture of how they see themselves. And do try to understand, it wasn't superiority against me, it was superiority against everybody, particularly the French. And so one has always, when you're in this kind of frame, you are asking yourself all the time whether it's racism, should you be hurt by it, right? It's probably always unfamiliarity, and that you're not part of a tribe, and that you're not trusted in some way to act in the manner in which they act. And this is a very difficult thing, so that there's a kind of cultural expectation which people have in those kinds of circumstances. When it comes to the VCs, there are all sorts of systems. One of the things I'm somewhat known for is a theory of sovereign funds and a new principle of citizen equity. And that is that the Lockean and or the Hobbesian constructs of political science, even down to John Rawls, for whom I have some sympathy, at least his thought experiment in a theory of justice, But the idea of the passive citizen who merely, and what you have is this problem, and it's relevant really, in the transition from active monarchies with actual political power to parliaments and congresses and so on. The power, the vertical of power didn't really change that much, so that effectively we've been constantly electing monarchs. And one of the ways in which that is true is the notion of government ownership. Because if the theory is correct, democratic theory, even John Locke's very sloppy theory in the two treaties on government, it means that government doesn't own anything. The citizen owns and the government manages for the sake of the citizen. And you know, Estonia has just made this a principle of their constitution, that they are not the rulers of Estonia, right? They are providing government as a service to the citizen. Now, I add to that an economic component that says the resources of the country belong to current and future generations. And therefore, it is the obligation of government to create a structure to allow people to realize the benefits of those resources and the preservation of a share of those resources moving forward for future generations. It seems to me that given everything from automation to the wealth gap, which affects more whites than blacks, to the loss of belief. One of the things I see across the world, it's not a question of whether people are conservative or liberal anymore. People have lost the capacity to believe in government, it seems to me, almost everywhere. So if you took the Estonia principle of government as a service and you added to it the idea that citizens are not passive in terms of the economics of their societies, and in fact, there ought to be something called citizen equity, all right, by which citizens have some direct measure of control or some direct engagement with the economic resources of their societies, and have to actively engage in preserving some of that value for future generations. This produces a more responsible citizen. But there's no impediment for Blacks or any group of people beginning to enact this kind of economic model right now. You have all the financial architecture, all of the various structures are available, from churches to social organization, to community groups, to Black colleges, however you wish to see them. The tools, the financial tools and the structures are available to create a situation where, and let's imagine that it's created, Blacks create this for themselves. If you have no enmity towards the dominant culture, and you're open to them on the basis that they ought to have been open to you in the first instance, according to their primary principles, then it creates this new momentum in the social order that and this is what Dr. King was aiming at with the Poor People's March on Washington. He saw almost in an epiphanic way that, I can advocate for Blacks, but I'm actually doing Blacks a disservice, because Blacks have to live in a world with whites, and they have to integrate with each other on police forces, as teachers, on school boards, and these sorts of things in various neighborhoods. But the truth of the matter is that the dominant society is prejudiced against these poor whites as they are against the Blacks. Now, how do we get them to see that? Well, again, this act of integrity, right? Where you use the tool, and this mitigation, where you use the tools to create this new paradigm. A paradigm that is open-ended, that invites all who believe in these principles, and the principles of citizen equity, human value, and government as a service to the people. That's the 1872 Republican Manifesto. That's what that is, which fulfills the Declaration of Independence more readily than any manifesto in the history of the United States. And so, you know, I do think that many of the so-called Black leaders have really been kind of racial entrepreneurs in some way. And they have operated in this space where the asymmetric conversation, they have found niches in that asymmetric conversation that benefited them and the people who accorded with them for an economic gain. And that we don't want to say that they are thieves and, you know, hate mongerers. That's not what we're saying. We're just defining the model that they have used, and we're saying that's the wrong model. This Estonia model of government as a service breaks the hold of the old monarchical imperative about government as somehow being dominant and the owners of the country, so to speak. And it becomes a Rousseauian democracy, such as you have to a limited degree in Switzerland, probably the most decentralized country in the history of the world. And Blacks can achieve that now. And you don't have to wait for everybody to get on board. There'll be any large number of whites and other groups that would cotton to this kind of thinking, because it's not socialism, which I know is a bad word in America. It's not socialism, right? It's not your typical rapacious capitalism that's based on extraction and the destruction of human values. So it's not neoliberalism, all right? It's not mixed government. It's actually on the principle of personal responsibility. If government is a service to the citizen, then you've maximized personal responsibility in that paradigm. If the citizen has equity and has already a responsibility to preserve some of that equity for future generations, you already have the economic discipline that militates against the kind of greed that we have seen, you see. And so if we were able to somehow map out such a model, it seems to me that we have a message then to send, and then would be a point of connecting to those 1,000 points of light, and then generating the Overton window, which drives that message and reforms society, such as we have been discussing.
Jen, I will offer a short additional answer. Gilbert was going into the economics, since you were talking about working in venture capital and being able to, you know, provide economics to people doing startup projects. And I think one of the major conflict theories the world looks at today is racial conflict. One of the other deepest conflict theories is economic basis of conflict. So obviously looking at economic self-determination of groups, it makes a lot of sense why there's so much focus there. But I also heard you asking a mimetic question, which is, how do you acknowledge, yes, there are a lot of Black children who are growing up without fathers in their home, without conceding a point to racists, see they cause their own problems. And so I want to offer something to the communication, because I heard a mimetic question, and I would say there are two things that I'll offer. One is the question itself is really important, which is, how do I communicate to whoever I'm communicating to while being cognizant of who is not my intended audience and what they do with that message? It is mind-blowing to me how bad we are currently at paying attention to the effect of our message on whoever isn't our intended audience, right? And so we don't pay attention to the polarization and blowback of, and to a large degree, it's because of the actual structure of the political process and voting. It's why people like Larry Lessig really want ranked choice voting, is because it would disincentivize polarizing the other side against you. Currently, there's only an incentive to get your support base to support you, and otherizing the fuck out of the other side is fine. And, but of course, if you want to succeed at anything, you don't want to engender a very large percentage of the world to hate what you're doing. And so the general principle for everyone communicating about everything to say, okay, who's my intended audience? Marketing 101. What am I saying to them? What am I trying to do? But also, who else is going to hear this? How are they going to respond? Because they're political actors and they're going to do stuff. So how do I make sure I'm paying attention to how everybody's going to hear it? I so wish everyone thought about that a lot more to avoid blowback and polarization. On the particular topic of fathers, that one seems so straightforward to me. There's many elements, but just to start with, when someone looks at the Reconstruction period, where Black communities were becoming wealthy, Black people were becoming doctors and lawyers and senators and et cetera, you had successful monogamous marriages where the fathers were in the home, right? There's nothing about Black genes that couldn't do that. They did that. So we're like, okay, what happened? And when you look at the total amount of rape that happened during slavery and then following slavery, and the fact that the men could not actually protect their wives from it, and that in even the period following slavery, where you had all of these bullshit reasons to arrest Black guys and put them in jail forever for really things that had no basis in reasonable due process or jurisprudence, for vagrancy, for loitering, for whatever. So white people and even white police officers could harass, fondle, rape, whatever, white women, and the men were completely emasculated. Can you spend 400 years emasculating the fuck out of men of a particular type and not have that have an effect on how they know how to be a man, you know? So it's like, yes, there's a fucking problem in the Black community with fathers, but there's a reason there's a problem. And the reason is not because Black people just suck at being fathers, right? Like there's an actual historical reason. So when you communicate about it, that's the other part of the story you have to communicate.
There are a couple of things there. I draw on what you've said, Daniel, quite effectively, and I apologize. I left that part of your answer unattended. The thing I would say is this: I always like to ask, under what conditions did people do what they did? So, not only did in the antebellum period did Blacks become physicians and lawyers and mortuary scientists, dentists. Dentistry was a very big one, and insurance was another big area. But state senators, school boards, all these kinds of things, and all over Grosse Pointe in Detroit, Rosewood we know about, Tulsa also. But people forget about North and South Carolina. These were places where people had developed interesting and powerful societies. Washington, D.C., another place where people had developed these really amazing, successful societies with good families and good jobs and these sorts of things. And if you think about this period, Daniel, this is when the lynching paradigm took place. So if you had a father, a brother, a son, a husband, right, an uncle, a grandfather, women were hiding their men. The Black culture, so if you go from Eugene Genovese's analysis of the plantation system, in which enslaved men ceased living in the same compounds with their wives or their female counterparts, because if the enslaver knew that you had affection for someone, they could use that as leverage against you, and they could come and rape and punish you and draw on your emotions. But terrifying violence, which is exercised again and again and again. You can read Philip Curtin, The Plantation System, all these wonderful books which lay this out for us. David Byron Davis also, and others. So if you think about that, the circumstances under which during the antebellum period these families were established means that those people had a high inclination disposition and propensity towards family, even after coming out of the plantation system, where they were separate from their families, right? So somehow they had maintained the ideal, and they kept that ideal in treacherous circumstances. So after 1879 and the compromise made by President Grant that removed the Northern Army from the South, New Orleans was the site of the first massacre, all right? And then Jim Crow came in after that. In the lead up to the First World War, so here you are, you've come out of enslavement, right? You haven't asked for anything. You've built a bootstrap so you can build yourself up by your bootstrap, all right? And so you've done that. So you are an instantiation of the highest performance of the American ideal, all right? And what is the response to that? Slaughter, mayhem, misery. And you come to a compromise, and the 1872 shows when the Lincoln Republicans were in the position to enact the true values of the Declaration of Independence. America showed that she preferred not to have that, and that was defeated, right? And then in comes Jim Crow. So now you're suffering that. And as Daniel said, both men and women, Black and white, believe two things about men: you're to be a protector and the provider. And Black men in the situation could do neither. And this is where, and at the same time, you were fully emasculated, not only that a white sheriff could walk up to you on a Sunday morning where you're walking with your wife and your children going to church and could harass or fondle your wife, and there's nothing you could do. And imagine a man standing there feeling all the sinews of himself and wanting to defend his wife and his family. And she's telling him, don't do it. This is what we have to get, the teeming quotidian misery of this situation. Now, if you understand that, and then you go into the lynching paradigm, this further emasculates the male, because now he's the hunted, the protected, the infantilized, all right? This is not French theory, this is what happened, all right? And out of that, leading up to the First World War, there's a fear that Blacks will not come forward and fight. W.B. Du Bois in the Crisis magazine writes an essay called Close Ranks. And why does he say that? Well, he says that because of the despondency and the nihilism that had taken over the Black community. He was saying, listen, wake up, let's go to this war and show we're not going to this war to win the war. That's not our primary purpose. Our primary purpose is to demonstrate a patriotism to those who do not want us and will abuse us and see us dead. Close ranks with them. And let us demonstrate, because they cannot be so psychologically infected with racism that they will see us go to die for a country that has treated us this way. And upon our return, they will not accept us, if not as heroes, at least as equally patriotic to them. I haven't seen very many works that, for all the studies of trauma and so on, and I read them incessantly, I haven't seen very many works on the trauma of this period of people going through this kind of thing. Ralph Ellison, however, writes a novel in which he depicts the condition of a man who has gone through this. And that's why it's called Invisible Man. I am invisible to the society. right? And so this is why Du Bois says, I ever feel my two-ness. I'm a human being and a Black man. And I can add to that a Foucauldian, although some certain British friends of mine will never forgive me for mentioning it. But Foucault advanced this concept of the panopticon. If you are Black in a lynching paradigm, you live in a panopticon. If you are Black in a paradigm where groups of men get together at night and come into a house and chase a Black man out and then hunt him in the woods with dogs, you live in a panopticon of terror. That's where you live. Blacks cannot nurse this pain. This is the problem. They cannot nurse this pain. This is the mitigation part. And Du Bois was seeking a way for both mitigation and an act of integrity. An act of integrity which could not be demanded by whites. An act of integrity which could not be expected by any reasonable psychology. An act of integrity that was so profound and so astonishing that Blacks followed Du Bois, went to war, performed magnificently in the war with acts of bravery, only to return home to be lynched in their uniform. And so, in a sense, Du Bois himself moved to Ghana, convinced of the idea, okay, I get it. You really don't want me. You don't believe in your principles and values. And even when you have breached your values, I don't ask you to repent. You don't ask me for forgiveness. You continue abusing me and putting my life in danger, reducing me to less than human. And so I say, I will take the extraordinary step of behaving in such a way that no human mind can deny either their culpability and my grace. And yet both are denied. Both. We're talking about fathers. In the First World War, the men went to war, the women went into the factories, Black women. When the men came home, the women left the factories thinking that their husbands would get the jobs. Such was the social order at the time. But the men did not get the jobs. They did not get the jobs. When the Second World War came around, the mothers of those women said, you will get a job, but now you will not make room for this man. And Orlando Patterson, the brother of or cousin of the former Prime Minister of Jamaica, P.J. Patterson, a sociologist at Harvard, wrote a book called Blood of Our Sons. I disagree with the thesis of the book, but he lays this out in some measure. And so when you're struggling against all of that, let us come down to today. There is a gentleman who is on YouTube. He gave a TED talk, and he says, if I go into a radio station or I go into a music, someone who commercializes music and say, I want to talk about Jewish people and I want to talk about killing them and them killing each other and so on, they would throw me out of the building. Okay, I want to come and talk about white women and shooting them and killing them and maiming them and so on, and that this is part of my manhood. They will be shown out the door. There was an interview with someone who presumes to call himself Charlemagne the God, as if Charles the Magnificent wasn't enough. But he gave an interview with a gentleman who's a music executive, and asked him, why do you keep giving people these formulaic songs about Black young men, about killing each other all right, and about having what they call beef with each other. That's kind of the sort of thing. And I'm not saying that all rap music is bad. I'm not condemning an entire genre. I'm saying that this is a particularly pernicious aspect of this genre. And I defy anybody to tell me how you can find beauty in self-abnegation. I don't know how one can find beauty in that. And his answer on live television was, I have people to feed, we have to eat, and there's a market for that kind of music. So again, when young men are being socialized by that, and then you add to that tracery of history that we've just gone through, how are you going to have fatherhood? How is fatherhood going to be a priority when baby mamas and multiple baby mamas, and when you can refer to a human being who has been with you to produce a child? And I'm not saying you have to speak of them in sanctified tones. I'm merely saying, again, this language, this categorization, right, is a categorization that denudes the human person of human value, right? It does not bring in its train affection. It does not bring in its train obligation. It does not bring in its train responsibility of any kind. And so if people are living in those circumstances and find themselves having to survive in those circumstances, how are you going to prioritize fatherhood, family, the sort of psychological resources necessary to live within a family context, to deny yourself, to sacrifice yourself for the immediate others who depend upon you, to keep your word, to be of good conscience, all right, and to be of a sturdy and reflective spirit. How is that going to happen? What is the context for that? And so the cycle continues. And I used to tease some American friends of mine who taught with me at George Mason University that they would talk about having bad fathers, but I would say they worship their fathers, despise their husbands, and idealize their sons. And so that's the cycle. That's the triangulation. It will continue because your father is doing what your husband is doing, but it's immediate to you, so that's a problem. But the son who is about to do it to another young woman, he's idealized and all responsibility is removed. That's not something that's inherent in Blacks. That is a feature of a social circumstance and a set of constructs and a history which has become asymmetrical to its potential solutions. And that has produced the world that we have today. So it seems to me.
I am glad that you answered that, and I'm glad that you asked that question. I think the idea that nihilism makes hedonism an appropriate rational response, I think that's so deep for so many issues. It's for this issue and consumerism and so many things. From from a like moral psychology perspective, under nihilism, hedonism makes sense. From a evolutionary theory perspective, if I could get killed at any time, maximizing the chance of offspring in many places makes sense. And so it's interesting to think about that. We are past time. There's so many places that I would like to go, but Gregory Thomas is with us, and he is also a scholar in related topics, and I'm really happy to see him here. And I wondered if you had any thoughts you wanted to share with us as we're wrapping up.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Gilbert, Professor Morris. That's mainly the spirit of my comment, in gratitude for what you shared. I'd like to briefly not counterstate, but provide some other narrative approaches to the stories that we're telling, because as we know in certain meta theories, integral meta theory, for example, that many things are true but partial. So there's such depth of truth and historical content that you shared that I certainly agree with. At the same time, there are countervailing narratives that we can draw upon. So for example, now the period you've been talking about, of course, going back to Aristotle, but mainly 19th century through the early part of the 20th century in the Jim Crow period, there were certain dynamics. Many of those dynamics continue. So we could point to the welfare system, where there was a disincentive for the men to be involved in the family, because if you put together, two incomes, you reduce the social support and network that's needed, and so other incentives against fatherhood. So that's another example. However, there are studies that show that even if they are not a husband in the home, that people racialized as black men spend more time with their children than any other group. Now, that's a whole nother narrative, but it's also some empirical research behind that. Yeah. But I'm going to go off this to give something that I'm very familiar with, a tradition that probably started at the turn of the century, but it really gathers steam from the 20s through the 70s, through the work of Alain Locke, for example. You mentioned Du Bois. Alain Locke is a very important part of this story. Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, who you mentioned, Albert Murray. There is a perspective on our history that is not just focusing on how much we were screwed over and the devastating impact of that, which is true, but what we were able to achieve in spite of that.
Yes.
How do you have a people to create through cultural forms, music and other forms that totally influence the music around the world?
Right.
One of the things that Ralph Ellison talks about, and this is not something that people highlight about Ellison's work, is that he makes it clear that if you are able to get people to dance to your rhythms, to play music that's based on the blues, which is the foundation of American music, if you're able to go from a march orientation where you are told what to do on the 1 and 3, but base the music on the 2 and the 4, and get people around the world tapping to that and dancing to that, that you have actually imposed your values on the society. So then you have a book like this, African Founders, How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals by David Hackett Fisher, that talks about how in different regions of this nation, Black Americans influenced the concept of freedom and the very culture we live in. So in spite of all that we've gone through, we've had a profound impact on the culture of the United States and the culture of the world. So I'll just leave with this. There's another book that I would like to mention, Culture of Growth, The Origins of the Modern Economy by Joel Moker, economic historian. He talks about cultural entrepreneurs. You mentioned racial entrepreneurs. And yes, Professor Morris, there have been many who have gotten their little niches through being entrepreneurs of racism, race, anti-racism, but there are also social entrepreneurs, cultural entrepreneurs. I consider myself one, those, and I appreciate you mentioning me before, who will be in the marketplace of ideas and will actually be entrepreneurs of certain epistemological frameworks, ontological frameworks that can influence the discourse, to use a Foucaultian term, to influence the very discourse we're in. And we're in a period of such political polarization, of such chaos within social media and such, that there's opportunity there for people, and many of you find this in the heterodox spaces, you find it in the Stoas and the rebel wisdoms, you find it in these different places. You have an opportunity to actually be entrepreneurs of not just ideas, but certain collectives, certain we spaces that you can develop so that we can influence the larger culture. And we don't need everybody to do this. The Enlightenment didn't happen through the majority of people believing a set of people with particular ideas that then influence the course and development of modernity itself. The same thing can happen now. And the last thing I want to say, because obviously you've given me the floor here, and there's so much more. I've been chomping at the bit to share. So I'm sorry if I'm taking so much time, but I really want to set up a conversation between you, Professor Morris, and Danielle Allen, Harvard philosopher Danielle Allen, who is one of the preeminent political philosophers of our time when we talk about democratic theory. She highlights the importance of Ralph Ellison as one of the preeminent democratic theorists of the 20th century in his work. She also highlights in this article, this essay I have, Integration, Freedom, and the Affirmation of Life, Dr. Martin Luther King as a key 20th century philosopher, political philosopher. But she is that, so are you. I love the ideas that you've laid out and the framings. We need to have people who are willing to not be reticent, to actually be entrepreneurs of ideas, cultural entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and who will engage in dialogue with each other to create a vision space, a possibility space from which people can then create forms, institutions, and such to actually affect change. And I would say we need a tipping point. We need a critical mass. We don't need everybody. We just need enough of us of a certain level of consciousness and culture to do this together. Now, I'm speaking in very general terms, and I have specifics to it. And I see the professor has stepped off for a second, but I'll stop there. Daniel, would you like to take the floor since the professor? Oh, wait. Oh, he went to get something?
Gilbert, are you ready to respond?
Yes. I love everything that Greg said, and to show you that we are on one accord. In the last conversation, I spoke about Alain Locke, and I wrote a paper on Alain Locke's interest in becoming a diplomat and working for the mandate system, which preceded the independence movements. And Alain Locke, he made the application, but he didn't get the job. He had a young understudy named Ralph Bunche, and Ralph Bunche went ahead and wrote about the mandate system of the Belgian Congo. And that was his PhD thesis at Harvard. He then was given a job first in the Middle East and then all across Africa. But Alain Locke influenced. So by the time in 1945, Second World War comes around, the United Nations Declaration, the notion of the Committee of 24 came from Ralph Ellison's work, inspired came from Ralph Bunche's work, inspired by Alain Locke. And I was writing that article in Turks and Caicos, which gained its international protectorate status along with Cayman, BVI, and Anguilla, and Bermuda. They came out of the construct set up by Alain Locke. So there's no question about the influence of Blacks across the region. Many of the teachers, the principals of what were then called the normal schools, all over the South. And these were parochial schools that were set up in various communities and so on. Many of them ended up in the Caribbean. And then a cross-pollination happened. Many Caribbean people after the Second World War ended up going into the United States and becoming teachers in New York and North Carolina and Texas and Florida and these sorts of places. The point about music is profoundly true. And your friend, our mutual colleague, the late Stanley Crouch, spoke about this in terms of blues and jazz and its cross-cultural influence all over the world. Coming from the Caribbean, we say the same thing absolutely about Bob Marley and Bob Marley's influence across the world as well. And so these are all points of mitigation. These are all acts of integrity where the fulfillment of talent, right? Because that's another type of obligation, human obligation, beyond, above, apart from race. Right? You have the acculturation of people existing within a particular social sphere that gives birth to something like blues or jazz. That's true. But the talent and the execution of talent itself, to the point of skill, that's a human trait. And so that reinstantiates human value in a non-racial way, in such a way that a Count Basie could live in the Bahamas, next door to a 10-year-old boy, and tell him stories about how, what he would call, they got down in the old days. By this time he was in a wheelchair and I used to push him along.
You were the 10-year-old boy?
Yes.
Oh my God, man.
And so that influence was there, but that influence did not exclude whites.
Right. That's right.
This is what's amazing. It did not exclude whites.
Right.
Because they were there as musical arrangers, as percussionists, as managers, as, you know, all sorts of, as beneficiaries, listeners to the music and so on. So you had this influence that exceeded the politics and the sociology of the dominant culture. Right. And so I agree profoundly with that. And I think what you have said really aligns well and drives what I have said, in the sense that I have said that this is what needs to happen. And you have said, here are examples where it is happening and has happened. And I think you read through my book, The Triptych Papers.
Yes. If
you remember, at the back of the book, I give about 6 examples of the types of things people are doing. A nurse in Nigeria who was not only became a nurse, but a nutritionist, and helped to build numbers of clinics, community clinics, and that kind of thing, developed a formula and went all over with that. Cami Sterling, a friend of mine in Lafayette, who started a reading group teaching Marva Collins was a hero. So she taught these things, reading, to even grandmothers in their 70s and 80s who'd never read in their lives. All right, so that work is being done. And we all know, and that work is cross-racial. There are people of every racial stripe that are doing that work and inspired by that work, because that work operates at the level of human value, not racial priorities. Right. And so these are examples of precisely what I think I've been trying to say. So I do think, Thomas, your remarks brings the entire discussion full circle. And so we have what needs to be done, what is happening, and what more needs to be done. And I think if we operate on that principle, what needs to happen now is groups of people in those 1,000 points of light have got to find a way to talk to each other.
Right.
The young technologists who studied with me, they often asked me about things, and I said to them, well, listen, why don't you make market mechanisms are very important. So why don't you make a list of those businesses which treat their customers, including Blacks, well and appropriately? I never saw the point, my father trained me in this, of going to a restaurant where you were not wanted, going to a hotel where you were not wanted. And you know this, Dr. King talks about this a little bit. Harry Belafonte, I had an incredible thing happen at George Mason University. Vernon Jordan, Harry Belafonte, and Sidney Poitier came to George Mason University. And my mother had always told me that I was beautiful, but I don't think that I could win any arguments on that night. And Harry Belafonte said the same thing that you said, that Paul Robeson told him. Sing your music, sing your songs, get them to sing your songs. And when they are singing your songs, they have to ask you what Deo means, what the Taliban means, right? And what daylight comes and they won't go home. What does that mean? And now you're engaged in a conversation where there's interest and feeling, and you've already touched the emotions of that person. And so the disposition to conversation has been established. And I do think that if somehow, I resist movements. I'm not a movement person, although I do think that people acting in their own spheres, who on occasion, where necessary and the opportunity presents itself, work in collaboration with each other. And if you can build systems that knit together informational platforms that allows me to know what you're doing and others to know what we are doing, then this is how you integrate those points of light and achieve an Overton window.
So we are closing now as we are just past the 2-hour mark, and I think we had booked for 90 minutes. So I'm grateful of everybody's time and attention, and really enjoyed that last conversation. And Greg, if you can get Gilbert and Danielle Allen to have a conversation, and that can have enough time, that would be fantastic. That would be really, really worth having happen and being like well produced and distributed. I will support that if I can. I really wanted to thank Peter for making the space for this and the previous one on the Stoa, because
Thank you.
The racial conversations are so, have been so culture war-y, and I think the Stoa has done such a good job of avoiding culture war, but rather than to avoid it here, to say, how do we lean into where it's hottest in a way that heals it? And so I would say, like, my hope is, and I don't know if it is the Stoa's dharma to do this or not, but I hope that whether it's a Stoa or other places, take the next step in this, which is more voices and longer periods, maybe some structured agenda and longer periods to unpack the way forward more. And whoever takes the initiative to do that, if I can help, I will, whether that is with a budget for production and helping to get the capital together, or helping with sharing it, distribution networks. If Peter or anyone feels called to do that and I can help, I'm here to do so. And Peter, do you have any thoughts you wanted to share before we close?
Just really appreciative of this session, for you, Daniel, for arranging it and having this conversation, for Gilbert coming in and dropping so much wisdom today. Greatly appreciated. And Greg might be returning to the Stoa for a secret session to continue these conversations sometime in February next year. So some of the stuff that you were gesturing towards, Daniel, might be happening. So we'll definitely reach out.
Please let me know ahead of time so I can share it and get more people there. And if there are things where more distribution could happen, but it takes somebody's manpower to do it, and we need to pay for that or whatever, like I would love to help actually have it be as meaningful as it can be. So yeah, please let me know.
Will do. And any parting closing thoughts for Daniel or Gilbert before I close up today's session?
I would like to say that the fact that people have come and stayed here all this time, I'm truly humbled by that, I have to say. And I have a mentor, Maurice Clinton, who's one of the most brilliant barristers. And every time I think I've caught him, I met him when I was 11. And there was a period for about 20 years where I spoke to him every night. And I was always amazed that this great man would take so much time with a young boy. And every time I think I am the Paul who's caught Gamaliel, or the Timothy who's caught Paul, he does something very Pauline. And I realize that I still have a ways to go. And he said to me last week, he calls me young prince, and he says, never mind that I'm 57 or 58, but he says, young prince, and he says, you've spent a lot of time analyzing the old, and you've spent a lot of time criticizing the old. It is time to stop criticizing the old and to inspire the young. And to me, it seems to me that the spirit of this conversation, the spirit of the Stoa, is that much has happened in our past, but nothing will happen in our future if we don't have the right kinds of conversation that can inspire the young. And so I appreciate that. And that is the spirit in which I participate here today.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you for that, Gilbert. And we'd love to have you back here at the Stoa for more sessions. And Daniel, you're always welcome, of course. And for more sessions, you can go to thestoa.ca. We have one this Saturday on seeking enlightenment, relationships, and nervous systems. That's 12 p.m. Eastern time. So that being said, Daniel, Gilbert, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Cheerio. Come to the Bahamas
Thank
sometime.